Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. Today, I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about what I think is really one of the most important parts of an M&A deal. But surprisingly, at least from my perspective, it's one that if you're a lawyer on a deal, you often don't spend much time, thinking about or working on. Niv and I were talking before we got on, and one of the things I find a lot is that the heavy lifting of a deal really starts once the lawyers have often celebrated the closing and moved on to another deal. So I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with Niv and also Lauren, who's a partner of mine based in our Chicago office, and we're going to try to dig pretty deep into what makes a great integration program, how do you do it, and how can you accelerate the integration process earlier in your deal without running afoul of the very important antitrust and competition law issues that will come up. So Niv and Lauren, I'm really happy that both of you agreed to kind of be a test subject or guinea pig or something like that and do one of these LinkedIn Live with me. So I really appreciate you both coming on.
Yeah, thanks, David. Excited to be here.
Thanks, that's great. And also for those who saw my earlier post, it's also Niv's birthday today. So happy birthday. No, I said no cake, but we're talking about some kind of integration. So
Yeah, why not? It's a fun celebration, David. It was an interesting day to pick. I had so many calls and messages this morning, and everyone's like, "What are you doing today?" And I said, "I'm doing this LinkedIn Live with David."
and people think that's weird. I mean, why are you possibly doing that? That's like insane. But to me, it just shows that you're like super psyched about integration.
Totally, yes.
And I can actually tell that when we first started talking, I think, which is again another benefit of LinkedIn, I think we had connected
Yeah.
before the holidays at some point last fall or winter, and we're talking. We had seen each other's posts, and I think I may have commented on some of the work you're doing, and I was just really interested in all the things that you've been focused on the integration side. And I think from the legal side, I've been writing a lot about that. I had a great talk with about divestitures and how those are working and how we're seeing more of those in 2023. But one of the reasons I was thinking about that is so many deals that you see on the M&A space, which I do all the time, don't work out. And I often hear that later, where maybe in its connection with a divestiture, but you start to hear about how the deal did not realize the synergies, did not realize the expectations that the buyer had. And as I've been looking into that a bit more, a lot of that sort of stems around integration, either lack of planning or poor integration efforts in terms of the execution. So is that, and that's what you do though, right? I mean, that's kind of your focus is integration. So I was very fascinated about that.
Yep, absolutely, David. We can dive more deep, but yes, that's kind of the my focus is post acquisition. It's really the integration work. But however, we will we'll talk about it a little more. But the deal team and the integration team need to be very, very closely tied in the hip to understand the integration risks upfront, to know what are the integration considerations in terms of operating model synergies, culture, and other people aspects. So really having a line of sight into that upfront, even when you're having those conversations, post LOI, even pre-signed. So having the integration team involved is very important right from the get-go.
And you actually have a background which I thought was great, because to me it's a massive undertaking. I mean, I think what I do, and what M&A lawyers do is challenging. I mean, it's an adversarial, kind of positional process. So there's a bit of tension usually in deals, and it's also a very fast pace, and there's a lot of moving parts. But when you think about integration and what you have to do, and people that are actually taking these very complicated businesses and trying to, combine them in some, reasonable way. There's a lot of project management type skills, I would imagine, thinking through like
Yes.
all the different things. So is some of your background, the things that you've done, before doing this sort of M&A integration focus, helpful as you were,
Yeah.
moving into this?
I mean, project management is absolutely a very, very critical skill in planning and executing integrations. It's something, obviously, I mean, I learned on the job. I did 7 years, close to 7 years of M&A, both buy side, sell side work. In my prior life, I was a research scientist. So not quite a project manager, but I learned these skills on the job. And yes, 100%, the biggest things are very, very complex program management, and depends again on the size of the company's, parent, target, the complexities, all of that. But program management, right, at a high level, complex program management, cross-functional stakeholder management. You have all your different functions to sort of facilitate, coordinate decisions, things like that, and then really influencing. It's, if you're in an IMO, you're kind of influencing, the various cross-functional, influencing without authority, in some sense, right? Really making those decisions, planning, execution, running the program, as well as managing up as well. You are reporting to the steerco, the deal sponsors, senior leadership. So really managing up, down, sideways. I think that's an extremely important skill as well. And then of course there's the classic program management, like you said. Managing the different milestones, activities, due dates, things like that. But this is just much more. It's program management on steroids, as I say. Yeah.
Well, that's why what I was, writing about was my thesis. And again, I think you'd agree with it. But the idea is, as deals, are, especially in the environment we were in 2020 and 2021, where valuations were just going through the roof, and there was a significant risk of overpaying for deals. And to me, and I think the studies show this, if you overpay for a deal, especially, in a significant way, there's no going back from that. And no matter how good the integration or how many synergies you dig up, it's going to be very hard to make that deal a success. But having said that, we're still seeing sort of slightly higher valuations. We're in a little different environment that we were then, with some more headwinds, and valuations are coming down. But still, the same issue, applies. You have to be very disciplined in your approach to a deal, and with there being more pressure on getting value out of a deal, I'm seeing more desire to kind of focus on integration earlier, and as you said, Niv, to integrate that more with what I do and what M&A lawyers do, and that creates a tension, Lauren. I think, because if we were to think of a situation where you don't touch anything, integration related, until sort of the deal closes, day one, as people in that business, refer to it, then you don't have as much to do or to think about, or stay up really late, worrying about. But as people like Niv and others move those dates backwards and really want to try to front load as much of the integration process, that's where you come in. And I assume that's where you have more, more concerns, at least more focus on what can be done, what can't be done, and how do we do it in a way that doesn't, bump up against the antitrust restrictions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where I come in more, right? There's obviously a need to start integration planning before day one, but there are significant risks with doing so, especially if the parties are in a competitive atmosphere. If they're competitive to each other, if there's a lot of competitive overlap to each other. So kind of two of the main risks are, the the level of information sharing that goes on prior to day one. They're separate parties prior to day one. So if they need to be careful in the type of information that's exchanged, they can't generally share competitively sensitive information business to business. There are certainly safeguards, and we can jump into some of those later, that you can put in place. But you need to be careful in kind of the type of information that's exchanged prior to day one. And then also on gun jumping, right? The parties until day one, till close, the parties need to continue to remain separate entities and competitors. And if they start to act as one company, hold themselves out as one company, if the buyer starts to exercise control over the seller prior to day one, that can lead to violations of the antitrust laws, which can lead to steep penalties. So you want to avoid that.
Okay, so that sort of paints the picture, I think, from the legal side and what's sort of been drilled into our head as lawyers doing it. So Niv, let me take it back, and since one of the things that I've been trying to do with this M&A series is kind of demystify, avoid jargon, give people sort of a real understanding of how things work. The first thing I want to talk about is, do you integrate at all? So kind of a preliminary thing. Now, we're going to answer that question, yes, I guess, at least for our hypothetical, so that we still have things to talk about. But one of the things I've been seeing, and you and I have talked about, is in cross-border deals in particular, or certain other kinds of deals, there is a trend, I think, to more partnering arrangements or standalone type arrangements where you don't fully or even partially integrate. I mean, there obviously integration in terms of vision and overall approach, but you leave companies sort of that you acquire in a standalone kind of fashion. You're not fixated on cost synergies per se, but you may be thinking about getting into a new geography or getting new technology or talent. So I guess maybe just some thoughts on how do you approach that initial decision? Do we integrate at all? And then if we do, of course, there's different levels of that you can go.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, David. It's, do you integrate at all, right? I mean, and a lot of companies do take that approach of just, keeping a business a standalone. It's, sometimes it's like a portfolio approach or a holding company type thing. But I think, the very first thing, as we know, the whole M&A process starts with the strategy, starts with the M&A strategy. So it is, we need to sort of, and the type of acquisition will sort of determine, this approach that you take to integration. So for example, what I mean is, let's say you take you're just trying to fill some gaps, white spaces in your business, and you want to, and it's a completely new product or service with very little overlap with your current business. You just want to build an arm sort of thing to your business. Maybe there's really not an overlap. It's just standalone, right? In that case, and it's going to be a very light touch integration in terms of, let's say finance or, just finance, IT, HR, etc. Some very minimum requirements for integration. But on the other hand, you could maybe it is you're trying to leverage the scale, right? Wherein you want economies of scale, you have more buying power, you have more, you have customers that you need to, cross sell to, things like that. So really, where there are overlapping customers or, customers, suppliers, things like that, both on cost and revenue side, where where you see opportunities, I think that's where really you need to integrate and realize those synergies. So again, it depends, right, on what the target is. What are they providing and bringing to the parent, to the acquirer, and then you kind of also evaluate where the overlaps are.
Yeah, it makes sense. And actually, Steve, you've weighed in with a kind of a comment right on point to what Niv was talking about, and I think it's sort of spot on. It's just you have to look first at the strategy, and then and then decide what sort of the goals and objectives you're trying to achieve, and then you can kind of decide what level of integration or not. But I think it's helpful to at least make that initial determination, because I think you're seeing more and more, especially in the cross-border context, like I mentioned, where there may not be as much overlaps, and the idea is to kind of keep that, culture, keep the vision that the acquired company has, and and allow that to kind of go on its own rather than doing a quicker integration. But maybe it's good to pop up. And by the way, on the questions, please feel free to lob those in. And there's a couple other ones, and I'll come back to those because I think we're getting some good ones. So if you do have any questions or there's topics that you want Niv, Lauren, or I to address, then please send us those, and we'll try to get to them. But Niv, why don't I pull up the little one page,
graphic, yeah.
the graphic. So I think this is a very kind of high level, but I think is great because it will give us a sort of a context to look at a typical deal. And I noticed that you have sort of this pre-letter of intent type process that you were talking about, which is sort of how does this M&A strategy fit in? How does that shape our target identification? The thesis that we're looking when we're trying to assess a particular business to acquire or not. And then you have this, due diligence phase. When do you typically come into the process if on a deal timeline like this?
Yeah, so that, again, it's not to scale, right? So not to get hung up on that, but, as early as the integration team can be involved in the process, the better, right? In terms of planning and really, planning for upfront for better execution and realization of synergies and assimilation of the two companies, things like that. So the blue boxes are really the deal team, the acquisition process in terms of like as we said, what is the strategy? Who are we going to acquire? Really going out doing that target identification, screening, etc. And then once you have identified targets, you do your more detailed due diligence that ends in negotiations and signing the deal. Now, the integration team is really, needs to be involved during this due diligence phase, so to speak. That's why there's this overlap. And that's really because you want to, typically it's operational due diligence. The functional teams are able to provide inputs into where the synergies are, and it's usually what we call a bottom-up synergy analysis in this phase. So it's like is it headcount? Is it supplier consolidation? Is it IT systems? So really going down, doing that bottom-up synergy analysis is what happens in that phase, and it's helpful for the integration team and the functional teams to get plugged in right away, so that when they're building their integration plan, it really ties back to the synergies. You know where the synergies are. Maybe you know how to get them. You know what the integration one-time costs are, like how much is it going to cost? Maybe you have to get out of a supplier contract, for example. So it's kind of, really brings those considerations during this phase versus looking at it post-close and saying, we had no idea, right? So that's why these two swim lanes are a little bit overlapping, and then once the deal is signed or announced, that's where you get into more detailed planning in terms of what's required for day one, your day one readiness, your more tactical execution oriented things. But really, the high level, more strategic type work happens in that, ideally even pre-sign. And those big like operating model decisions, right? Do we even need this? Should we eliminate this? Can we outsource? I mean, I think some of those really big decisions should happen very much earlier in the deal.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And of course, sometimes, as you said, that's not to scale, but depends on the particular deal. So if you have a deal that, has a lot of regulatory approvals, for example, or, we're seeing more of that with foreign acquirers where you may have to go through a more elaborate foreign direct investment type CFIUS in the US type review, or otherwise have, longer term approvals, you could have between that sign and day one close. I mean, I've certainly worked on deals that have been 7 months, 9 months, up to a year or so, depending on the timing. in a more typical deal where maybe you don't have those sort of long tail approvals, you might be, but you may need stockholder approval, may need to get a proxy out. It could be, again, even in those cases, 3 to 4 months. Lauren, one thing that I think in terms of the timeline, I'm guessing that you would like to be brought in, and you and I would normally start working together fairly early as well, because we want to start thinking about, is an HSR approval going to be needed to make a filing? Are they competitors and have overlaps that we need to be sensitive to? What's the competition risk? So how do you fit into that timeline that Niv walked us through?
Yeah, I mean, I always encourage people to include antitrust counsel, at least start the initial discussions, even at that target identification and screening, because antitrust counsel can start to, at a high level, identify whether or not a deal is going to pose significant antitrust risk, right? Whether or not there's significant overlaps, the level of potential investigation of that merger. And then you want to closely then involve antitrust counsel, particularly in due diligence and kind of everything until day one close. Because again, this goes back to making sure that the type of information that's being exchanged between the parties doesn't run afoul of the antitrust laws. And then also post signing, making sure that any kind of integration planning activities, again, not only in the information exchange, that all of that is appropriate, but that the parties aren't taking any actions that would be indicia of control, that the buyer having control over the seller. So we always say, like, integration planning is great. Execution prior to day one, it can be troublesome, especially when there's a competitive overlap. And, I wanted to flag too, I was focused on the level of competitive overlap, but even vertical transactions now that are getting scrutinized by the agencies, I think there too, you still need to be careful in the type of information that's exchanged, because if you're the buyer, the seller might have information about your competitors that you shouldn't have access to. So it's not meant to be that just because there's no direct horizontal overlap that you can freely share information or start to act as one prior to close.
Yeah, it's great, and I want to circle back on that. We could have our own, maybe we should, like, just on antitrust. But one thing I often run into that people get confused on, and maybe you could react to, Lauren. There's this idea, of course, the HSR type approval process people are familiar with, and most of the deals that probably you and I work on, they're big enough where you'll trigger that. With the pandemic and some of the changes that are happening with the agencies, you're not getting that early termination that you were able to get in deals prior to that, which would kind of cut a couple weeks off of the typical 30-day approval. So even in deals where you don't need shareholder approval or regulatory approval or some longer tail type things, you're looking at, in HSR type deals, 30 days, give or take, assuming you get the filing in, pretty quickly after signing. A lot of times that's, you have a week or two after signing to kind of button up the filings and get those in. But that gives Niv more time to, to do her work as you're working through the HSR process. But whether or not you need HSR approval, that doesn't matter, right, Lauren, in terms of what you're talking about, in the sense that some people, I think, are confused by that. I don't know if you've run into that if you don't have HSR approval, if the deal is smaller than the 100 million, whatever that current number is, in transaction size, that you're free. But the competitive restrictions on anti-competitive behavior, those apply irrespective, right? So you still have to go through your analysis even in deals that are smaller than.
Yeah, correct. Even if it's not HSR reportable, I mean, if the parties are competitors to each other, if they exchange competitively sensitive information prior to close, if they coordinate in any way with respect to customer strategy, that can all run afoul of Section 1 of the Sherman Act, which prohibits price fixing, bid rigging, market allocation, customer allocation between horizontal competitors, right? So any of that can run afoul of the antitrust laws, which can lead to significant penalties, criminal exposure, if they're separate entities. So that's very high risk behavior, and you'd want to get antitrust counsel involved just to put safeguards around. Like a little bit of precaution can save a lot of headaches down the road.
Yeah, it's important, and I think Lauren, what I've always found working with you too, and what you're showing today is you don't have to be afraid of the antitrust lawyers, because I do think there's a lot of concern about that, because it is sort of heavily economics driven, right? And it does quickly get down into the weeds, especially when you're thinking about overlapping markets, what's market concentration. I remember I have bad dreams about the HHH index and all of these. So there is a lot of complexity, right, in what you do on a day-to-day basis in assessing that, but it's still important to kind of loop you in early so that you can get a handle on some of these issues that you might have to address during the process that Niv's working on.
Yeah, and being proactive about it is always a good strategy, right? It's good to get antitrust counsel involved early. We can help you develop strategies for making sure that you're mitigating that risk, and often you can kind of get to the same information that you need. I mean, it might need to be more aggregated, it might need to be more massed, it might need to be handled by third-party consultants, kind of on a more detailed level, and then aggregated mass that what is shared with the actual parties. But I think it's helpful to have those conversations early on between antitrust counsel, the integration team, the deal team, to kind of lay out the guidelines, what you can and can't do. And then I'm always happy to have a conversation of what are you trying to achieve, right? And then think about ways that you might be able to achieve that without running afoul of the antitrust laws.
Yeah, it's great. And actually the comments are all kind of the few I'm reading or weighing in. I will say one of the comments wrote about M&A science and some of the work that they're doing, and Kisan that you're doing. I'm not sure if he's on, but he's doing in this area. And so for people that are interested, definitely I'll throw out a plug for M&A science. They have a lot of interesting information topics, writing about agile integration and other kinds of approaches. But I think their focus, and they could weigh in if someone is there, but their focus is really to also drive that process forward, integrate it more with the deal team, the diligence team. That's where I've seen on the deal side a tremendous amount of siloing. And I wrote about that the other day, where I was saying that, it's very hard when somebody who's making the promises about synergies and cost savings and revenue enhancements, all of these things that go into a deal, aren't the same people that actually are tasked with implementing it and doing it. And if those aren't the same, then you often will get a mismatch in what's obtainable, what's achievable, what you can do. So I do think there is this push to move things forward. And so I think, Lauren, people doing what you do are going to be asked, pressured, cajoled a little bit more to get in quicker, find ways, as you said. It was great that you pointed that out, that you can often get where you want to go in a different way, perhaps, but still get the process moving as people want to do a bit earlier. So Niv, I guess I'd come back and then let's look at this initial kind of stage, this timing. What are you thinking about when you're first kind of brought into a project, and often you're coming at it from the outside perspective, but what are you sort of thinking about at a high level, and what are the first things that you want to start doing as you are thinking about integration before the day one period?
Yeah, David. I mean, I'd written about this in one of my posts as well, but it's really that, the setting, sort of anchoring on a set of guiding principles, right? When I first come in, just starting off, it's like, what are we trying to achieve here? And like this timeline shows here, it's really working with the deal team, right? Again, if let's say I'm an outsider, in-house corporate strategy development, perhaps the teams work closely with each other. But if I'm coming in from the outside, it's really understanding that the M&A strategy, the current state of the operating model of the target, and then sort of where are those synergy areas, what are the deal value drivers, right? And again, it depends on what level of synergy assessment has been done, at that time, and as Lauren said, how much of actual numbers we have, right, in terms of whether it's at aggregate level or whatever, but really how if we have to translate this whole thing, the strategy and the deal thesis, into a set of guiding principles, So when I say guiding principles, it is, at a high level, it could also include decisions by the deal sponsors to say, some really high level decisions. We're going to migrate an ERP system, right? For example, it could be like some of those higher level decisions may not be as much in the weeds, but some high level decisions. And then what's going to happen on day one, like a day one sort of plan, maybe a future state, sort of maybe a future state plan, things like that. But at a high level, we need guiding principles for the integration. With that said, then we start to mobilize the integration management office, right, the IMO team, in terms of who are the various functions involved, right, the key functions, and then really during the high level planning phase, start fleshing out this operating model, this concept of operating model, right? In terms of what is day one going to look like, what is future state day two going to look like, and we can define those timelines, right? To say day one and then 1 or 2 years post day one. So really defining that operating model, function by function, and sometimes it could also be sort of a more end-to-end type view. A lot of things are cross-functional, right? For example, your inventory management, forecast to fulfillment process, for example. What is that going to look like? So at a high level, really having those discussions on the operating model, both at a functional level as well as a critical cross-functional process level, is important. And then really the third aspect is the synergies, right? So there have been, there will be some high level synergies that, this deal team would have assessed to get to the valuation. But really doing that sort of, or supporting, and working with those functional teams. And exactly like you said, David, like the functional leads do not really know where the synergies are unless they are, truly involved, unless they're involved in the process. So really, if they are part of this, operating model dialogue, if they're part of this, where is the value creation dialogue? I mean, they are already sort of, they're involved in this process from the pre-sign phase. So really, mobilizing all of this, mobilizing the IMO, the functional leads, having those operating model synergy discussions, talking about where the deal values are, and really coming up with a blueprint, right, function by function, and perhaps additional areas to deep dive into is where we typically start, and then it sort of moves into and then setting up the IMO. So there are there's both the program level setup as well as all the different stakeholders, who's going to lead what, who are the people involved. This is really a team sport, right? It's a lot of people, that need to be really working towards the same vision. So really mobilizing that IMO and planning for the integration is the first piece. The second one is, what I call pre-close planning. Here is a little bit more detailed planning. And here's where we really get into like the tactical stuff of what needs to happen for day one. And there are additional work streams like communication, change management, things like that, right? We are, people are a huge part of integration. So, how do we manage that process? What are the different communications that need to go out for like suppliers, customers, investors, employees? I mean, that's a whole work stream in itself. So really getting into that very detailed planning is that second orange chevron of pre-close planning. And then as Lauren said, we can't really execute on anything. It's all just planning. So really execution starts post-close. And post-close there is that transition period, wherein The first 100 days are mainly, transitioning employees, systems, basically hooking up all the wires, things like that. And then maybe we can go after some quick win synergies in that period, but really there could be some longer term synergy initiatives like, a procurement supplier rationalization, for example. And those might take, it can take up to like one or 2 years to really achieve those synergies. So some of those long-term synergies are then kind of transitioned to the businesses that own it. So that's really how, that's kind of the life cycle of this. Happy to hear your, Lauren's thoughts as well, especially where there's data sharing and, how much of detail do we have, especially for synergy planning, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, Lauren, I'll shoot that to you. I think, Niv, what you're saying is the exact reason why I think for lawyers and people that are in-house, and I think we'll certainly have people watching that who kind of fit into those two categories. I just never understood why there wasn't more sharing with the legal teams. At least I've found a lot of times you have to almost, beg for that information to really understand sort of what are the deal drivers, the financial, the people, all of those sort of overarching themes. And what are you trying to achieve in terms of some of the things you mentioned, operational synergies or revenue, tax, all the different things that go into making a deal successful, however, one chooses to define that. But that can shape how you draft the documents, what kind of reps you use, whether or not there's certain aspects of the legal diligence that you need to focus on to make sure that you're not going to have unanticipated costs. I can remember deals, for example, where there were, and I think you mentioned something like that, Lauren, there were hedging contracts, break fees, other sorts of things that had been overlooked and resulted in a very significant cost overlay that really ate into the synergies that were being anticipated. And had the legal team and the business teams been working better together, a little bit more, orchestrated, things could have been done in the document drafting phase that would have helped with that. And I think it also comes through in the transitional services agreements, how those work, how easy or more difficult, how much friction there is. And I've actually, Niv, you and I talked about this, I've actually been doing what I think are somewhat more innovative approaches when there are earnouts in deals or other kinds of contingent consideration where you may have an opportunity, maybe not in all cases, but in some cases, to tie in some of the earnout contingencies or the payments that are happening after closing to the cooperation level, the attainment of certain, hopefully objective, easy to determine, but transitional type integration matters. And I think linking those together, not only gets the incentives lined in the right way so that you have the seller team, post-close and the buyer working, more closely together, but it also helps to achieve some of those synergies, that you're anticipating in the deal. So linking the lawyers in early, I think, beyond what Lauren is focused on, I think will help you draft more tailored, more focused kind of surgical documents and create less friction and hopefully generate, a more positive return. But going, Lauren, to you, one thing I've always just, I think we should just kind of be clear on is what is a competitor? What's a potential competitor? And what is competitively sensitive information? Because we've talked about that, but I always find that either I forget or people that I'm working with forget. And is it true that if you're, let's say, a more of a PE buyer as opposed to more of a strategic, if you don't really have other companies in your portfolio group that are similar, can you just forget about all this essentially? And are you free to, assuming the seller is willing, are you free to just start integrating, executing, do things much faster because you don't have that, competition overlay? So I know I threw a lot there, but maybe grab a couple of those as you think and maybe touched on them a bit.
Yeah, no, it's a good question of what is competitive. I mean, it really is fact dependent too. And I hate to answer that with that because I know that's an easy way out, but it really is fact dependent of like the parties and what their interactions with. I mean, the easiest example of clear competitive is both parties sell widgets, right? Like they both sell widget A, and so they compete with each other regularly. That's an easy example. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is in the potential competitors, right? If whether or not one of the parties is thinking could potentially enter the market down the road, are they not, active? Another key question is, so there's kind of two components of, are they competitive in the same product or service market? And then also the geographic market, right? Are they part of the same geographic market? So that's something that Antitrust Counsel would look at closely, kind of get the facts, assess what the competitive overlap is. In the P&E context, if you don't have part of your portfolio, if none of your portfolio is competitive with each other, it probably does reduce your risk a little bit in terms of the type of information that can be shared, just because there's not competitively sensitive information that's being shared between horizontal competitors. But on the integration planning versus execution, you still could run into a foul of the gun jumping laws, right? I mean, if a transaction is reportable under the HSR Act, you need to wait the 30 days before failure to wait the 30 days before you start to integrate can run afoul of those and lead to significant consequences and penalties. So, it's not to say that there is no antitrust risk in those situations. There certainly is. But again, I go to, on the sharing of competitively sensitive information, I think we've talked about this a lot. David, you and I have worked on these a lot, is clean team agreements is a great strategy for trying to get the information. Often if you're using third-party consultants, you can kind of put everything into that black box for the consultants to see and share with the consultants more competitively sensitive information. You just have to make sure that the consultants understand what can be spit out of that black box, what they can share. Sometimes they can share more aggregated information, more high-level recommendations, but they need to avoid sharing any kind of granular, competitively sensitive information. And that's where Antitrust Counsel, again, can come in. Often the clean team agreements say that the consultants or anyone who's part of the clean team needs to, Antitrust Counsel needs to approve anything that's coming out of that, right? Any kind of product or discussion that's coming out of that. And that's where we can, I think, be helpful as well.
Yeah, all those are great suggestions. And I guess one thing I would say is, again, this is not a check the box sort of a thing, in the sense that, you put a lot of time and thought, and some of these clean team arrangements, people sort of throw up their hands when you say, I think we should do a clean team, because they can be, challenging to negotiate. They can take a fair amount of time. Some I've done, I know you've done a million, that are pretty quick and you put them in place pretty fast. But others, depending on the sensitivities involved and just the parties, I mean, can be a whole work stream in and of themselves, and can take weeks potentially to actually get locked down. I've certainly been involved in a few of those that just dragged on because there's a lot of sensitivities and pressures that both parties are sort of trying to work around. But once you have that, and you have the people that are on that clean team, and maybe you could touch briefly on sort of who those are and what competitively sensitive information is, what categories would trigger it. But once you have that in place, you have to make sure it's actually implemented. And I know I've seen, FTC or DOJ type things where you've had all the sort of the showy stuff out there. But then when you actually got into the emails and the communications and the sharing, people on the clean team were forwarding information or leaving it out or whatever it was. And so if you don't have the actual, process in place to make sure that you're actually complying with it, then it's not, I guess, as people say, not worth the paper it's really printed on. So you have to make sure, and that can come up, I assume, during the HSR review, process, if they see information that looks like it's been shared improperly. But anyway, so any thoughts on sort of that additional piece?
Yeah, I mean, first, I guess to answer your question on competitively sensitive information, I mean, kind of the most highly competitively sensitive information is going to be anything customer specific, pricing strategies, negotiation strategies, competitively sensitive terms and conditions, costs are competitively sensitive, employee wages and benefits are competitively sensitive information, kind of future R&D plans can be competitively sensitive. So those are kind of among the most highly competitively sensitive. In terms of who is on the clean team, again, you can have third-party consultants. You can also always have in-house, business people people on the clean team often, but what you need to make sure is those people usually don't have any responsibilities or involvement in setting prices, in determining costs, in negotiating customer contracts, those kind of things. So whatever the nature of the competitively sensitive information that's being shared, you want to make sure that the people on the clean team within the business don't have any responsibility, oversight, involvement in decisions or issues within the company related to those issues. So they're kind of walled off from that. And then the clean team would specify that anyone on the clean team can't share that information then with them, right? It's not, they can't work around that. So that's kind of the essence of a clean team. And you're right. I mean, there's some that are much easier to put in place and some that are much more difficult. I've had some transactions that have different levels of clean team, right? So you almost have there's a certain clean team, and then there's even subsets of that even fewer people have access to certain types of information, or maybe only third-party consultants have access to certain types of information. So making sure that everyone is aware of what the boundaries are, what the guidelines are, and that they're following through with that and carrying that out, I think is just critical.
Yeah, and even just communications outside of it, we're so used now to using these kind of Zoom things, or streaming, or just sending things around through data rooms, but people still talk. And I can remember deals when I was an associate where people would fly around in private planes, visiting facilities, do other things with antitrust counsel in tow. I don't know if you ever remember those days, Lauren, but and they would be in the plane, and their job was to make sure that people weren't communicating. Now, these were very sensitive competitors, hard, they were trying to deal maybe that was going to potentially be challenged anyway. So uncertain as to whether it would get done. And so there were a lot of antitrust lawyers, flying around in private planes just to make sure that information, wasn't being shared at facilities or other places. So you have to think about it, not just the document exchange, but just in general, what people are talking about, and different levels of sensitivity, of course, will, raise different concerns. There is a question about timelines, which I think works well. And I think Lauren actually answered that. Question is, it's critical to manage timelines. I've definitely written a lot about that, agree with it 100%. I think the saying, people often use in M&A is that time kills deals, which if it's the wrong deal to do, then that's a good thing. So delays are good because maybe you get yourself out of something that you didn't want. But if it's a good deal for both parties, then you want to execute, quickly. Usually bad things happen the longer you go. But Lauren, you kind of hit that, which is be proactive, not reactive, and, build into your timeline the expectation that things are going to slip, because I've never seen a deal myself where that hasn't happened. And timelines, can be set in the beginning, but they're very fluid. But if you want to try to keep as close as you can, you have to sort of anticipate where there's going to be problems, where there might be delays, and then build that in, or front load. Like, again, don't bring in someone like Lauren, after the LOI is done, as you're just starting to work, because you may discover that there's going to be a much more difficult HSR approval process. Maybe there's hurdles that you can't overcome, and you've wasted a lot of time and energy going down that. So starting that process earlier and sort of thinking or looking around corners, or thinking about things that can come up, is a great exercise that everybody should probably employ. But certainly, somebody doing the M&A side of a deal, I think, has a primary responsibility for that, for anticipating where things go wrong. So Niv, on one of the things I've been reading more about is the importance of sort of people in the integration process, or culture. Are you seeing that? Do you agree with that those are areas where, beyond just the numbers and closing things down, or consolidating things, or squeezing out some additional synergies, how do you think about that in terms of the people who are impacted? Because what I've seen is that people are scared. They're worried about, what is my role?
Yeah.
Who's my boss going to be? Or in a lot of cases, will I have a job? Am I going to be employed? So how do you, and so they're operating under a sense of anxiety or fear. And of course, you want to keep it under wraps a bit. So there's a lot of rumors, a lot of things that circle around deals. Is that something that you've seen as being a trouble spot? Do you focus on that when you're thinking about integration?
Absolutely, David. I've seen that a few times, and it's it's natural for people to have that anxiety of, what does this mean for me? I mean, ultimately, it's their jobs, their roles in the company, and integrations have this thing of headcount reduction and all of that. So people who are in those sort of, let's say, a G&A type role might have that on top of mind as well. So yes, absolutely, and it creates a lot of lot of anxiety, right? And the term you used, it creates a lot of anxiety. But I think it's pretty much, it comes to communication, the attention given by leadership, the sort of having a very open, transparent communications with employees, and if it is indeed impacting an employee, that's unfortunate, but there are some difficult conversations as well, right, that that management would need to have. So yeah, I mean, I think communication, so communication is the first piece, and then I think you mentioned culture somewhere, right? Sometimes cultures can be very different, especially if it's a big company, doing a bolt-on, smaller company culture versus bigger company culture, right, can be very different. So really assimilating this, having a more, you have to create this environment for information sharing, for teaming, collaboration, things like that. Especially when I'm seeing a lot of clients are buying it, more technology or startup-like companies, the startup cultures, right, that are more very agile, that are very that don't really play by any rules. And then here you are with a lot of processes and approvals and this and that, right? So you've got to really create an environment of collaboration and teaming as well. So to bring these people on board. Yeah.
Well, that's why, like you said, sometimes, what you most wish for, you get it, and then you actually don't want it, because an example you gave is perfect, that, you're excited about getting this new, great technology and this team that's very, agile, as you said, that, is very creative.
Yes.
But of course, once you have them, then they just don't fit into the box, that you're used to
Yeah.
doing. And that can become, quite difficult if if you are doing, let's say, a full integration, versus more of, we talked about in the
Actually,
beginning,
yeah,
partnering.
that brings up I had worked on this deal, which was a very big company buying a very small, like, startup type company, right? So one of the considerations also, whether you fully integrate or partially integrate, is culture as well. If you want to, sometimes you might kill a company if you fully just absorb it, assimilate it, right? You want to keep it separate. You want to put some you want to invest in it. It's more of a invest in strategic growth of that business unit, right? So that is also a consideration, actually, when thinking about integration strategy, whether you keep them separate, fully assimilate, what do you keep
Yeah.
separate, what do you absorb, etc. So
Yeah.
culture is
Yeah.
a big one. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Adriana also had a great comment along these lines, and I totally agree with you that there's different approaches, and so we talked about that a little bit in the beginning. That you can leave people kind of standalone acquired companies, do a partnership model. Um, Adriana was saying about using maybe distributor type arrangements or other things, more flexible, rather than trying to, fully integrate immediately. So all those are excellent points. Well, I think we've covered a tremendous amount. I mean, we could easily do a part, 2, and probably part 3. And I think, Niv, again, for being on your birthday, dropping so much incredible, stuff was great. And hopefully you have, like, a fun time planned. And Lauren, as always, terrific to get sort of your expertise on the antitrust side. I think that's, obviously super important, and, something that everybody should be thinking about early, so that you don't get any surprises, and you don't going to the timing point, you don't put any kind of, further delays in it. So I really appreciate, Lauren, and both of you, for taking a chance and, trying this and coming on.
Enjoyed this, David. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, for.
All right. Oh yeah. Thanks, Lauren. Well, if anybody else has any other questions, connect with Lauren, connect with Niv, and we're happy to continue the conversation. Or if there's demand, I can convince them to come back for another round. So we'll have to see. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for calling in and participating and for the questions. Appreciate it.